I think it's the last of our series for the year.
Mm-hmm.
The series is Cinema of Conflict and Transformation, that is curated and directed by our professor, Dr. Mark Cunningham, who will introduce himself to you shortly. My name is Shireen Khosropour. I'm the director of the Center for Peace and Conflict Studies that puts on this film series along with other events. You can find us at austincc.edu/peace. I won't go over all of the stuff that we put on in the interest of time, but if you want to stay connected with us, just email me or Layla, or just get on that austincc.edu/peace and see what we're up to. So I'm going to turn it over to Mark Cunningham. He'll say a little bit about himself, introduce himself to you, and he will introduce the other panelists. Mark?
Yes, good evening, everybody. My name is Dr. Mark Cunningham. I'm an actual associate professor here at ACC in the radio, television, and film department. I teach courses in Intro to Cinema, focusing on such areas as Black American cinema. I teach a course in the New Hollywood cinema from 1967 to 1982. I also teach a horror film class, and hopefully, crossing fingers, I'm working with my department chair to teach a course on David Lynch in the fall, hopefully. So we'll see what happens with that. My research interests are in the areas of Black American cinema, Black filmmakers, but also just popular culture in general, and just film and television also as well in general. I'm currently working on a book based on my dissertation on race, gender, and narrative in John Singleton's self-described Hood trilogy, which includes the films Boys in the Hood, Poetic Justice, and Baby Boy. And I'm writing that for Columbia University Press's imprint Wallflower. So so that's a little bit about me. And so Layla, I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce yourself, and then you can, our guest panelists.
Sure. Well, my name is Layla. I work as a program coordinator for the Center for Peace and Conflict Studies and the Interdisciplinary Studies Department. And I'm really excited to welcome both Habiba Noor and Banafsheh Madaninejad, sorry. And I would like to invite them to tell our audience a bit about themselves. So we could start with Habiba, if that's okay.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. I'm Habiba Noor. I teach at Trinity University. I'm in the Department of Education. As a sort of visiting professor, my research is interdisciplinary at the intersection of media cultural studies and education. My work has been around representation of Islam and knowledge construction around media narratives of Muslims. That was what my PhD was focused on. And I did my PhD in the UK at the Institute of Education, which is as a part of UCL right now. So yeah, that's me.
And Banafsheh, do you want to tell us about yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for inviting me to this panel. Feels good to be here, especially alongside Habiba, and seeing Shireen again and meeting Mark and Layla for the first time. So I'm an immigrant from Iran. Shireen wanted some juice to this story. I'm going to give it. So I'm an immigrant from Iran. I came here to go to college. I studied math and physics first, worked for a few years, and then went to grad school, totally in something else, and got my PhD, worked for about 10 years teaching, and then left in 2019, and for many reasons, but Trump had something to do with it. And also being a contingent professor had something to do with it. So, and I set up an organization called Interconnecting Arabs, Muslims, and Middle Easterners. And And in fact, we are starting a research project this summer. Well, we've started it, but it's going into full effect in June, where we start interviewing groups of folks to get a better picture of how internalized racial oppression works within this community, and to hear stories. So it's sort of a narrative storytelling project where people, our questions come from the sidelines, not hitting it right on the head, but hoping to hear stories and tidbits and pieces about how folks feel about themselves as brown folks or Black folks, and just, but being Muslim at the same time. And we're focusing on Muslims specifically. And this is not a study that has been done before, as far as we know. And this was what I was doing as an academic. So it's kind of a continuation of that outside the academy, and it feels so good. Okay, I'm done.
Well, so the first thing we were going to do, because we're watching an episode of the television show, the award-winning television show, I might say, called Ramy, which is about a young Muslim man from Egypt, actually, that is trying to navigate the terrains of the Western world while still remaining true to his own cultural background and cultural traditions. And as we know, right, the Western world has a mighty pool when someone is trying to remain true to their cultural self or their cultural origin. And so that becomes the focus of this television show. So in the spirit of celebrating Ramadan, which was the first day, I believe was yesterday, right, of Ramadan. Was it yesterday, the 13th? Is it today?
Today.
It's today. So we're really right on time, starting with today, with the beginning of Ramadan. And so this episode is in fact called Do the Ramadan, which is Ramy again resisting the pull of the Western world while he tries to remain again true to his his cultural origin, and also too in the celebration of the religious holiday of Ramadan. This show it's just so rich, I think, in characterization and also in narrative as well too. So many good characters here, and those of us who's so I strongly recommend watching. There are 2 seasons so far. There's going to be a 3rd, so I strongly recommend if you haven't seen them all to watch them. But I mean, I think it's a very good show in my estimation. But that's why we have our experts here to help me with some of the narratives and themes of this film. Make sure I'm reading these things correctly. Because I mean, I expect this to be as much an education for me today as it is for the rest of us, I hope. And so before we start, because we've been saying Ramadan, so for those of us who might be unaware, could you all kind of explain the purpose of Ramadan and what its celebration entails? Banafsheh or Habiba?
Habiba?
Okay, well, Ramadan is one of the months of the Islamic year, and during that month, Muslims are, one of the pillars of Islam is that we fast, which is no food, water, intimacy, smoking, backbiting, anger, all of that stuff from sunup to sundown. So it's like for 30 days. Mm-hmm. And of course, there's exemptions, health, menstruation, from the sort of legal standpoint, that's what it is. And it's observed all over the world. And that's, and another thing is that aside from that sort of like physical discipline, there's also a lot of additional prayer. So there's, in addition to the 5 times prayer, there's another evening prayer, and many people try to read the entire Quran during the month of Ramadan. But I think what Ramy shows us is sort of like that lived religion experience of Ramadan, which is that it's an opportunity for people wherever you're at to kind of get back into the practice. But Ramadan, I would say it is kind of like a disciplinary practice. Yeah.
So when he is in the film and he's kind of, you know, it sounds funny listening to him in the film kind of talking about, I want to use Ramadan to get back to me. And you know, it's like it's this personal, you know, kind of like retreat or something he's going on. But really, as funny as it sounds coming out of his mouth, he's really kind of utilizing it for the right, I mean, he's doing what he should be doing during this time.
I think he is, you know, he's taking that opportunity to kind of connect and to rid oneself of whatever habits they think of as bad. But, you know, the thing is that it's like, okay, well, when Ramadan is over, then he'll get back with his woman or whatever that woman, you know, whatever that relationship is. Okay, after 30 days, okay, yeah, then I'll come back. But then I was, you know, watching his face, you're like, is he thinking that he's going to come back or not? So that's, yeah, so that's the question. But yeah, I think that actually for people who identify it, and maybe others might want to speak on this, but who I think would identify as believers, they would, and I think that there's something relatable about the way he does that.
Okay.
But not everybody would necessarily want to admit, you know, or they won't expose those things quite in the same way, or there might be coded in terms of like, what is it that you're trying to shift away from? But there's also this acknowledgement, even in it coded, like even at the mosque among the super Orthodox, that there is like a desire to kind of return to something or to get back to basics.
Okay. Banafsheh, would you like to add something to that?
Sure. Yeah, what's really interesting to me about Ramadan is imagine having a month to just spend on how you want to be. It's just right, and you're supposed to do it all waking hours, basically. The potential is amazing, and not on just sort of a behavioral, psychological, you know, self-interested sort of way, but in a what's going to get me more grounded. I want to shift things inside. I want to, you know, self-actualize more. I want to get closer to whatever I consider to be the source of wisdom, life, whatever. I mean, this is like a major, and this time is structurally given to people. Despite moving towards capitalistic, you know, just everywhere is going uber capitalist and rabid capitalist, but still there's this time. Like I lived in Egypt during Ramadan, the whole month. Things truly become molasses. Wow. People are not expected to produce. Iran, a little different. Unfortunately, yeah.
I love that visual picture that you just painted, like that people are not expected to produce. Like this is, and that you say it's like molasses, right? Yeah. So I mean, because that's really interesting, right? To kind of think about a time where everything slows down, and so it's so interesting in thinking about Ramy as somebody who's I'm not Muslim, of course, right? And looking at this show and knowing this character, it just sounds like pure selfishness coming out of his mouth, what he's saying, right? But it is, in fact, right, you know, the time for him to do exactly what he says he's going to do. I love the idea of, like you said, having that time to, you know, be into yourself in that way, for sure. Yeah. Shireen, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I wanted to add to what Banafsheh and Habiba have already said. I also grew up in Iran. Another aspect of it is that, from what I've seen, this kind of focusing on what Banafsheh was talking about and Habiba needs to happen in community with other people. So trying to make it happen for a population in the diaspora is really hard, especially for those of us, you know, in mixed marriages. It's really, really hard. Then it becomes kind of like the maybe the capitalistic self-improvement. You know, it can take that note. Where you are fasting because you have a few pounds to lose, or maybe you've like read about this intermittent fasting and how that's really helpful to reboot your system. And so the community is a big part of it.
Oh, wow. Okay. So does Ramadan happen at the same time every year?
No, it's because it is a purely lunar calendar that just because it does not match with the solar calendar, it shifts 12 days a year. And so it moves throughout the solar seasonal calendar.
I know that. That's wow. I didn't know
that. And there's also sort of debate within Muslim communities about how to determine the beginning of the month. Since it's lunar, is the beginning of the month starts when you see the first crescent after the new moon. But because it could be done with calculations, sometimes, you know, there's sort of a calculated date, and then there are the people that believe that you have to, you know, you don't need to view the moon to start the month, whereas others might say we have to see the moon in our location to start the month. And so that's why that little debate between Uncle Nassim and Ramy was about, you know, okay, you're starting today, everybody, you know, knows it starts tomorrow. You know, that's a typical thing that happens.
Wow. So I mean, that's what I love about this show too, and what I'm loving so far, even early on in this dialogue, is that like this information that you all are giving me, right, adds so much more nuance to this show, right? I mean, and this is what I think some of the, you know, I think the education in terms of when and why it's necessary for us to have film and televisual product that gives so many different perspectives, because look at these things that we learn, right? And how much we learn about people, right, in this regard. And I think this is such an example of that. Again, and I love this show, but then like this is even, you know, enhancing, you know, parts that I just thought he and the uncle was like, oh, they're arguing about what day it is. And the uncle is just being like the old guy, not want to listen to the young guy. But that's like, you know, this real, you know, just actually a real kind of dilemma of sorts. So that's really interesting. So in keeping with this kind of discussion of Ramadan and ritual, so correct my pronunciation. Is it Fajr?
Fajr.
Fajr?
Yeah.
The prayer. So I found it. So I noticed specifically, right, that Ramy, and they show us this in the clip, has you know, alarms set on his phone to be able to know when that is. Is that what we see reflected in the episode when all of the men get together? Is that what's happening then, or how does that prayer apply?
Oh, yeah. So Fajr is the early morning, the before dawn prayer, and that's so there's 5 times. And so, you know, interesting thing is he probably, you know, there's this whole thing during Ramadan. Well, no, there's an app. It's called Muslim Pro, and and so if you have the app, or there are several apps, but Muslim Pro is probably the most famous, and they've gotten into trouble recently. That's a separate story. But the alarm goes off at the prayer times. So, you know, many people will turn it on during Ramadan, and then next thing you know, you have your, like, you know, the call to prayer from your phone 5 times a day. I wonder if Ramy had it on before Ramadan. I'm guessing that he wouldn't have.
Yeah, I was thinking he probably didn't.
Yeah.
For sure. Vanessa, you have anything to add to that, or no? Okay, all right, I'll move on to the next. Oh,
there's a question from Isabella.
She says that as someone who is not Muslim, I always wondered how much of the show was accurate. Yeah, Isabel, me too, Isabel. I assume, not being Muslim, like, yep, this is pretty accurate. I'm thinking, but I'm finding out now that it's actually quite accurate, and accurate in ways that I wouldn't have imagined, right? That these nuances, right, that are being added into the show, right? That are very interesting.
And I would add to that is like things that I would have never ever imagined seeing on a TV show. Right. And so I feel like what's happening is like what this show does is it kind of leads with the inside joke, and it's making that it's not, there's no explanation for what those inside jokes are, but we get them, like, the Uncle Nassim and the Ramy, and then, they're very particular inside jokes to being, I think it's doing the Ramadan in the West as a minority, right? So very specific things that I always wonder how non-Muslims can find it funny, because it seems like it's just for us,
Wow,
yeah.
Well, this is some things that Toni Morrison speaks of, specifically talking about African-American culture or Black culture. When she's writing in her book, she says, I don't bother to explain things. Yeah. She says, because as a Black person living in a country that, where white, a white narrative has been preferenced, right? We have been put in a position, those of us who are not white, or those of us who are Black or people of color, have been put in a position where we've had to learn those things, right? And so I think this is very much so a case of, Ramy, I feel like kind of working in that same space. No, I'm not going to explain that. If you want to know what that is, then you read about it, or you come to a panel discussion like this, right? And you seek that information out for yourself. Yeah, it very much so reminds me of that. Yeah, Kenny says, are there any emerging generational conflicts within the Muslim community? Yeah, that was a question I was going to ask, actually, about this generational this kind of generational divide of sorts, right? So this is perfect. So that Kenneth is like right on the nose here. I was gonna ask that same thing, like, what are the generational challenges, right, of maintaining Muslim traditions or customs, and how is this conveyed in the way Ramy interacts with his friends, for example? I know it's like his friends, I noticed with Ramy's friends in particular, he and his friends, right, from their vantage point as kind of young Muslim men, kind of like being kind of caught between tradition, and then here they are with the Nikes and the Brixton hats, and and very much so kind of engaged in this kind of Western popular culture, and then here's the the uncle and the parents or whatever else, and even seemingly the way even too that Ramy's kind of, even in his more kind of, I guess, evolved Muslim self, I guess you would say, with this kind of Western influence, that he, in fact, right, very much so kind of falls into these kind of more patriarchal structures that we have, particularly in the way that, the family deals with him and deals with his sister, as you see in other episodes of the show. So, yeah, so Banafsheh and Habib, what do you say about that? This kind of generational conflict within the Muslim community, and then also too with these guys being as young Muslim men.
Yeah, as soon as you brought that up, the thing that just jumped into my head is there's an episode in the second season throughout up until that point. In many of the episodes, the mom and the daughter are having just their relationship is filled with tension, and it was a very familiar relationship for me, and it's just constant, because I have a brother, and the way that the parents deal with the brother versus the way the with Ramy versus how they deal with the sister, just the double standards. Also, it's just so many things, but it's mostly the constant nitpicking and fault finding, and nothing she does is good enough or right. And finally, at one point, the daughter just turns to the mom and says, "Mom, you're just mean." And she's like, "What? I'm not mean." She goes, "No, you're mean." And I thought that is a generational gap, because the trauma that woman has grown up with, as far as given up, and we see how she has given up her dreams. She didn't finish college because she married the father, had children, how she just came to the United States, left her family, all of the things, all the trauma of how she was treated. She spoke languages, she knew French, she was, she had dreams, she kept saying, right? And then just nothing. And now she's just empty. The children haven't even left and she's empty.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so many different kinds of trauma that she's had to deal with, and how that's just made her mean.
Yeah. I think the show does a beautiful job of kind of giving us that kind of perspective on the mom, for example.
Yeah, I heard you say the mom's your favorite character.
She is my favorite.
You say that.
The mom is my favorite character because, she's the one I oftentimes in the story feel the most sympathy for. The sister too as well too, but the mom in particular, because for everything that you just said, I mean, in the way that I think about those episodes of the series where she's driving the Lyft or the Uber or whatever else, and the things that where she herself, right, is kind of balancing that kind of Western versus old style tradition. And the way that she thinks, for example, when she's talking to the black girl in the car, you should wear your hair like Beyonce. And she thinks she's being complimentary. But
you should straighten it. She says you should straighten
it. Yeah, you should straighten it like Beyonce. And that girl,
wow. She actually says, wow.
Wow. And she literally thinks she's being complimentary, right? But that kind of bluntness, right? That just saying whatever is on your mind is very much so kind of an old school tradition, right? Which is something I think any culture can kind of relate to. Like older people tend to be blunt like that, but it just manifests itself, I think, very differently in different cultures. And like I say, I don't think she thinks she's being insulting at all,
No, actually, that's what I was going to say. I don't really think this has much to do with being from the Middle East either, right? I think this is exactly, at some point, the daughter says, you never stop to think what comes out of your mouth and what effect it has on other people's feelings. Like this, but this is something that we have really recently learned how to do as a people. And but this I had not seen this shown, and it goes beyond Middle Eastern culture. Like I've seen mothers from different right? I've seen white moms do this.
Yes.
But I haven't seen, and I watch a lot of films. I've never seen it presented like this. That is just done so well. This is something my mom lives with me, so this is I'll just stop there. But it was a really interesting thing for me to see.
Cool. I mean, but what do you say about this kind of generational gap that the show presents?
I think what's interesting about this particular show is that it represents something that we see in the community, where sometimes the gaps are not always what we can expect or predict. Like, for example, Ramy's enthusiasm for Ramadan is seen as surprising for, Uncle Nassim, for example, right? It's like, oh, you're into this. Oh, okay. Like there's this intentionality around what you do. And I think maybe that's sort of like, if we think about one of the things that happens in this generational divide is that your participation in traditions becomes intentional. And so we see so much of that intentionality with, with his uncle and then with his parents about, oh, aren't we supposed to go to the mosque and do this? And they're like, oh, we're, watching TV, So then it becomes the younger person that's trying to sort of regulate the family on religion, which is a phenomenon, right? It's a big phenomenon. It's something that we see in the Muslim community.
Oh, really?
Especially I would say it's been very big in Europe and in the UK and definitely in the US, but where the kids become more religious. I mean, Ramy is not the typical character because he's exploring, but then oftentimes more so than the parents, right? And so this is something again that, but not doing so in any sort of from a place of alienation, right? Like I don't feel like he's doing, there's this typical trope, which has been common in sort of Europe, about the radicalized, alienated Muslim youth, right? They're, experiencing poverty, then they turn to religion and, then they become radicalized. Like this is kind of like, we've seen this in some media, particularly coming out of the UK, but and even to some extent in the US. But what's interesting about this is that it deals with this sort of intentionality around religion, but in a kind of that's really focused around spirituality and intention, bringing spirituality and intentionality to the conversation, which is different from the way the parents do it, which is this is just what we do, right? This is our culture. It doesn't, we're following our traditions. We're not making active decisions on how we are going to participate in them. And so we see this throughout the whole episode, right? He's constantly making decisions. Whereas the way he's approaching these decisions is a little bit different from the way his friends approach those decisions. They're less reflexive about it. And they're just kind of, again, like his parents, they're kind of just following along with what they ought to do. Whereas Ramy, he's this character who's very reflexive of his experience,
Do you think he kind of treats, like you say, these things that should just kind of be the part of the fabric of who he is, and he's treating it like these big events? Like, look at me, I'm wearing, oh gosh, I wrote it down, what it was. But I'm wearing the guy, yeah, I'm wearing that, I'm doing that, look at me, I'm doing. And they're looking at him like, dude, that thing is actually too short for you. Like, what, everybody kind of pointing out these things, but he's treating it like, do you think, is this kind of, do you think it's like a bit of a discovery for him, even though it's kind of been around him in his entire life?
Absolutely. I think, talking about identity formation, I think that's what he's trying to do. That's what this generation is trying to do. Those of us who grew up in our home countries, it was just, we didn't have to think about who am I, and am I a Muslim, am I not? We just were, everybody was, or the majority of people around us were. So we didn't have to react to anything or select anything. We just were in that soup. But this generation here has to find pieces and claim that identity for themselves, which is why you might see them wear ethnic clothes more, or go to the mosque when, my parents only went to the mosque during Ramadan and some other holidays. But, the generation here may, make that more of a custom, more of a habit to claim that identity, to figure out who they are. I think you've got your finger on that.
Right. I think, and that, like I said, again, it is kind of very indicative of youth period, right? But I think particularly of youth, those of us who are in marginalized cultures, right, that we tend to have these things happen. Like I remember in the 90s when, we were all walking around here with the Malcolm X caps on, and we had the African necklaces on, and we were wearing dashikis and looking at our parents like, y'all are forgotten. And I remember my mom looking at me going like, well, I don't need to do that to be Black. I know I'm Black. I don't have to. To me, it's very reminiscent of that, right? Like that, that's why his parents like, boy, be quiet. We watching TV. We don't have to do this. We already know about this. Like we do this every day. You're the one that's actually kind of not doing it every day. So
I want to say something.
Yes.
Yeah. for sure. I just 100%. Couple of things. Some of us are still trying to figure out. We're not kids. Still trying to figure out the role of and Islam and what Islam, which Islam in our lives, especially since Trump. Yeah, and the role of ritual and the role of community. Whereas before Trump, it might not have been life or death to have a community around you and be Muslim. All of a sudden it became, holy crap. I gotta find me some community that I can write or create one. Because it's yes, getting weird now. And also, I was just gonna say that the shows that they're watching, they're musalsalat, which is series like Ramy, but they're only 30 days long, and there's an episode every night, and there's several of these series. They're specifically made for Ramadan, and there's certain countries that make them. Turkey, Syria, no longer Syria. I doubt it's still going on in Syria. Those were the two big ones, and Egypt. And they were starting to buy some Iranian ones. I don't think that's happening. Yeah, that hasn't been happening for some time.
Yes.
Yeah. So, and this is what I was gonna say. Listen, it is the most joyful. I'm not talking about Iran. I'm talking about Egypt. It is the most joyful people are the whole year.
Oh, wow.
I'll give you an example. Tuesday night. I use this as an example a lot when I talk about Egypt. It's Tuesday. It's 4:30 in the morning. My apartment is close to the Nile. And there is children, there's music, there are these small boats going up and down the Nile because it's nighttime. They can eat and party and listen to music and dance and do their thing, right? Children got to go to school the next day, but nobody cares. I'm telling you, molasses, life comes to a halt and it's time to have fun.
Wow.
It's time to live. This is not the case in Iran, but it definitely is the case in Egypt.
Wow. And not the case in the United States.
Oh, no.
Yeah,
for the Muslims,
Ramy,
right?
It's a very heady thing for Ramy. He even said, got me in my head. Like, it is not a body thing. It is all a body thing. It's all about the body and getting out of the head, but not for him.
Wow. So, Habiba, if I can piggyback on something you just said about the United States and it not being that way, what Banafsheh is describing in terms of this kind of freedom and what have you, and you said this not being present in the United States. So what do you think the challenges, what are the challenges of kind of maintaining these Muslim traditions in a more Western culture or Western society? What are the challenges of that?
Well, I mean, the challenge is that you don't have that community, right? I mean, I've seen many people describe how coming to the United States and they don't necessarily continue the Ramadan rituals because they feel that it's so much tied to community. And so for people who, have that experience, then you come here, then you just kind of lose your desire and interest, right? But what ends up happening is, I think, there are many communities. I'm currently fasting right now, and many people that do this, but it has had to become a very intentional thing, right? Something that you have to put in this kind of work and say, okay, despite it all, we are going to do this. And then the rationale is not necessarily tradition, right? Rationale becomes very much tied to religion and spirituality and or just plain old obligation. Like, if we are going to get to heaven, we have to do this, right? And that's like when people ask, why is it that we fast? This is our obligation. You go to the mosque, you see hundreds and hundreds of people of all ages and sizes, and you're like, wow, that person fasted, this person fasted. You're like, wow, you know, all these people have been doing this for so many days, you know, and here I am complaining. And then you're like, well, they feel that this is their obligation. And so and then it goes, that's how it shifts from just like tradition and rituals to just fulfilling an obligation. And when people start seeing it as fulfilling an obligation, then it takes on, it just becomes more purely religious, as opposed to community, you know, this community affair. And then you have to buy into that, right? And so people, so that's definitely a challenge. And then you have to see that challenge, and you have to be willing to or interested in engaging in that challenge, right? Some people will be like, oh no, sorry, you know, this is too hard for me, I'm not going to do it. But I'm just saying, my own children, right? They're in the 4th grade, they know I'm waking up and doing it, and I'm like, no, you know, I don't think you should do it, but they insisted, they see it as a challenge to do it, right? And so it becomes this whole, it's not just like this is what the community is doing and we're all doing it. There's this whole narrative that we make around fasting in the West that I'm not sure if it's the same thing in Muslim countries. I wouldn't know, because I've never fasted in a Muslim country. Closest I've been to doing that was in London, where I had so many Muslims around me, and you know, and there were people that was like, you know, not trying to say anything about England, but where there were lots of Muslims around me during Ramadan. But yeah, I think there's a lot of challenges, school, work, but that's when, you know, there's certain aspects, sort of the religious aspects of the tradition, which are, one of the things is that nobody knows that you're fasting. It's a very personal, I mean, it's a very personal thing, and that is very much a part of the tradition as well, that nobody knows you're fasting. I mean, you could take it in many different ways. You can take it as sort of like a month-long celebration, or you could take it as a very sort of like reflective and intense in personal time. And it's all available, right, for people. And so people have their different ins into the experience of fasting.
Banafsheh, what about you? What challenges do you know, or that, you know, in terms of kind of in terms of Western culture in trying to maintain, you know, Muslim tradition?
Yeah. So I am a child of the Iranian Revolution, and after the revolution, we had a theocracy, and that cured the majority of the people in Iran of religion. And by that, I mean a sizable portion are actually Islamophobic at this point. There was a recent study that came out, it was a couple of years ago. It was, I think, the first year or second year of Trump, so it was more than that. And they were a group of researchers in Europe were using the internet to collect data inside Iran about levels of religiosity. And over 70% said that they not only did not practice, but wanted nothing to do with Islam. So I grew up in that kind of environment where praying, I did a period, I was always into this sort of spiritual stuff, and any foray into it was completely shut down and ridiculed by my parents. I did it anyway, but I had to bear the brunt of that ridicule constantly. And it was never obviously the form of Islam that was being pushed on us. I was also like traumatized by that, but I knew there was other things, and I had someone who was kind of helping me get familiarized with Sufism. And so and then after coming here, there was no time, and also it became dangerous after 9/11 to even go there. It's very confusing. And then when Trump happened, I was like, you know what? I don't have a space in the mosques. I don't really like the attitude my Iranian community has, which is all trauma and, just trauma responses. For the most part. So there's got to be another way. So I have spent some of my energy trying to figure out it's been,
wow.
That's the challenge. Yeah.
Wow.
And I know there are a lot of people like me inside Iran, but here, no. Yeah.
Wow.
So there was a time pre-2011, 2009, that I used to go back to Iran, and I was able to connect with those people who grew up like me with the same, the same environment, but have found their spirituality that is centered and rooted in Islam somehow. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Shireen, you had your hand up. You were going to say something.
Yeah, I wanted to add to what Habiba and Banafsheh have said about the challenges for the Muslim community during Ramadan. I know Banafsheh and I have used both Ramadan and Ramazan.
Yeah.
It's the same thing. Ramadan is closer to the Arabic pronunciation, and Ramazan is how Persians say Ramadan, basically. It's the same thing. So challenges for Muslims who observe Ramadan in the US. Another one is back to community. While we don't have our Muslim community around us, we all belong to different communities at work, especially when we had to go to work physically, and being constantly challenged by people about what you're not eating. These are like donuts at the meeting. Why aren't you eating? So you say, I'm fasting. And then there is coffee. Well, you can't even have coffee. No, you can't even have water. That's really bad for you. I can't tell you how many lectures I've heard people giving Muslims about how water is essential. Even like if you're in Texas, like how can you go without water? It's really bad for your kidneys. So that part is really heavy. So there is a fine line between being curious and interested in somebody's culture and kind of veering over to the part of either exoticizing it and saying, wow, you are amazing. How could anybody do that? Or challenging it. So yeah,
wow.
That's I think a huge challenge.
I could definitely see that. I mean, people doing that for sure. Yeah.
So I don't share. I don't say anything.
You don't? I just don't want any.
I always find other ways. Oh no, like somebody, they brought breakfast rollers today. I was like, no, I ate really early. Done.
I see. Yeah. Got you. So let me ask you all this question. What does a show like Ramy represent in respect to the representation of Muslims in mainstream televisual or cinematic narratives? Where do you position this show? How do you, is it
revolutionary?
Really? No, really though, do you?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's hear more about that. Why revolutionary? Because I admit from my vantage point, never really having seen anything quite like it.
Yeah, think about what you thought about Muslims before Ramy. And what you think about Muslims now. Revolutionary.
Right. Well, I didn't think anything bad or anything like that, but I certainly, on the other side of the show, have a lot more understanding about Muslim culture and people.
No, not bad, but
I know what you mean. Yeah.
Complicated. Just like.
Because now, just by at this point in the conversation, I'm thinking to myself, I need to watch this show again with everything you all have said in mind.
I mean, I feel like, well, the show is not trying to explain religion, right? It's not. It does that, but that's not the intentionality. It's not trying to defend religion, and it's not framing Islam as the problem. at all,
Mm-hmm.
which is actually also quite different, right? If you think about sort of representations of Islam, whether it be in popular culture or in the news, is that there's some problem, you know, there's this good Muslim, there's a bad Muslim. I mean, Ramy takes his whole good Muslim, bad Muslim and puts it within the community conversation. Is like, you know, he ends up with like, it's more like good person, bad person, right? For a Muslim, right? You think about in the last line, the little boy walks in and says, "Are you a bad person?"
Yes.
Right? I mean, that's him asking himself, "Are you a bad person?" And it's just about being a person, right?
I
And
just
so
slept
from
with
that,
this man's wife.
yeah,
Yeah.
yes, actually.
Uh-huh.
I just slept with this man's wife, and here I am trying to do the Ramadan, even though he doesn't actually say that. But yeah, so, and it doesn't frame Islam as the problem at all. And so from that standpoint, it's quite a big deal. And it's you know, and even some people, some shows like, I think it was like Evelyn El-Sultani's book, where she writes about sort of recent representation of Muslims in popular culture, and says that, you know, the way, you know, it's not all bad, right? But there's always like a good in relation to the bad, right? If you see sort of the terrorist or whatever, or someone who's like backwards, or there will be the modern Muslim that sort of serves as a contrast to that. And so it kind of reproduces that trope, right? Where it, you know, the problem is not the religion. It's just, and I think I heard some interview with Ramy where he was talking about that being like a central force in some of the decision making. And it's just, you know, I've never seen, I would have never expected to hear certain conversations that I've heard among my people in, you know, on screen, right? Like whether it's like which day is Ramadan, or you know, like the whole clothing thing, which again, by the way, I can relate to, because I'm from South Asia, and like my shalwar kameezes have always been outdated and a little not fitting right, because we don't travel back and forth so much to have it updated. Right. And so this is a phenomenon that happens where people might not be wearing the right thing, but they want to wear this thing that they feel is more traditional and right. But then you're like, nah, this isn't working. But yeah, all of those things, they're like I said, these inside jokes. And like even with the conversation with the potential wife, you know, this debate, this sort of theological issues around what we call deen and dunya, meaning like this world and the afterworld. This is all like, it was like my mouth was like wide open when I was watching this, just like in disbelief. And then I'm like, this is for us. I really felt like that. But then there are those moments where he sleeps with that woman, and during Ramadan, I'm like, you know, sure, I'm sure maybe that did happen, but there's something about the way they represent some aspects, like that end of the scene where he goes home with that woman. That's one of those things where I'm like, I think they're trying to really push some boundaries, both for the Muslim community too, you know? And so they're pushing all of these boundaries.
Yeah, you know, I think that's true, because I think there's that whole set piece with the uncle who is very, very rigid, and then we find out he's homosexual.
Yeah.
You know, those things that happen on this show. And to go back to Banafsheh, what you said about how you see Muslims prior to after. And I think, and please tell me, and I certainly don't mean to say this and be reductive, so please tell me if I am being reductive, but this show really humanizes Muslims to me. That it's not just this thing that you hear in the news that's every time. I mean, I always think about in the news, everything we hear about Muslims is shrouded around something that has to do with terrorism and war, right? And then here is this show that is going, oh yeah, I didn't accidentally do it, but I slept with this woman's wife, or, you know, yeah, I'm gonna catch you on the next prayer, or, you know, and it's, the mother, like the daughter, like you were saying, but it's telling the mother, you are mean, you know, and these kind of generational gaps, which is so human. And to me, that was what was refreshing. We never get to see that. It was so refreshing. You know, and he has that episode where he does deal with 9/11 and how Muslims were perceived after that. But even that was done to me in a way that I thought was much more refreshing than anything we ever get elsewhere. And so,
which, by the way, that was my least favorite. That was my least favorite episode, which was right before this one.
Right. Why was it your least favorite?
Because it was tired.
Okay.
You know? Yeah. it was well done.
Mm-hmm.
But it was, and it was kind of traumatic. I was talking to Habiba over the weekend about it. I was like, that episode was just like, just made me feel all,
Did you think it was just unnecessary, that he just didn't really need, he didn't have to?
No, he needed to. I think it just, it just made me feel stuff that I felt right after 9/11 and since, that I haven't really, like.
Yeah.
I thought it was interesting because
interesting is what I'm saying. As far
I
as
thought that one was interesting because it was from a child's perspective, and he really went into that and kind of really thinking about how the personal becomes political, like at a very sort of like developmental basic way, right? Because that's when he like discovers like masturbation too, and thinks that somehow that caused 9/11, right? And so like it takes the personal and the political to another level, but the fact that the personal, everything becomes political for Muslims, post 9/11. I mean, even pre 9/11, if we're talking about the personal and political, but like in a really intense way after that point. So it really exemplified that.
Okay, you just made me think of something. This show does something with sex and Muslims.
Yeah.
I mean, sex, whether it's straight up sex, whether it's, sex between straight folks, sex between homosexuals, sex, period, is private. It is not shared really outside. It's not spoken about outside, and if it is, it's between men or between women. It's not a public affair. It is, one of the revolutionary things was just talking about it, and in such an inflammatory way. Like, this married woman during Ramadan.
Can you do me a favor?
Yeah. Will you do me a favor?
Yeah.
And then she confesses about it to her husband.
Does. Yes, she does.
I'm like, some of the stuff.
And it's a friend of their family.
Like, I just don't see it.
Like I said, then the guy ends up being a friend of the family, and the dad confronts Ramy. He's like, hey, are you kidding me with this? Right,
My favorite character is the father.
Is it really? Really? Wow. So, gosh, oh my gosh, this has been such a good conversation, and I just got the word that we kind of need to kind of start wrapping up. Which I want to mention too, that the wife in that last thing with Ramy, the episode we just watched, is played by an actress I really like, Purna Jagannathan, who has just been fantastic in a bunch of stuff. And most recently on the Mindy Kaling show, Never Have I Ever, where she plays the mother, and she plays this more kind of rigid, old school, kind of traditional style mother. I'm not sure. I think they're Indian on that show, if I remember correctly. But she's fantastic in that as well too. But I want to end on this then, because I want to piggyback on something that you said, Habiba, that I think is important for us to know. And you said, this show is for us as Muslims, right? This is for us. And do you think sometimes, right, like I think about this sometimes when I'm teaching Black film to my students, and I say, this is distinctively Black, this is for Black people. And then I kind of catch myself, but everybody should watch it, but but where do you place the power in saying and being able to say that, this is distinctly for us, and that there is nothing wrong with the fact that it is for us? Other people can watch it, whatever else, but this is for us. Where is the power in that? What power do we get from that kind of marginal, a culture, right, that is so ill represented and underrepresented, can the power that they can take from that?
I mean, I think it's recognition, and it's also permission, right? It's permission to do exactly what he's doing, which is they don't have to explain things, right? Like Ramy's not explaining things. The script writers didn't feel like they had to explain things to be legible as just regular folks, right? I'm not going to explain things either. I don't have to make explaining the foundation of my identity here, which is what I think has been defining for Muslim community in the US, is explaining yourself. So how do you live when you don't have to explain? There's a kind of freedom that can come with that.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's the power is in a type of freedom that if we can take it, if we'll take it and use it, then that's enormously empowering. So I think that there's a lot of power there.
Okay. Banafsheh, what do you think?
Well, yeah, totally. I love, somehow I didn't hear Habiba, you saying that, but I love that. Yes, this is a show for us. And I always feel like when I'm explaining, I'm apologizing at the same time.
Yes.
So being strained.
I love that you said that. This feeling that we have to apologize for things being for us. Why can't we have that? Right? We give of ourselves in so many other ways, and so much. It's kind of like Shireen, what you're saying here. We finally get to be in on the joke. We don't have to explain it. We get to laugh about it, and the rest of you are left wondering. Instead of being always on the other side of that. Always being on the other side of that. Oh my gosh, I wish we could do a part 2 to this. I have so much stuff about other stuff I want to ask you all. I mean, a 30-minute.
Let's do it. I'm game.
I'm sure like a 30-minute show that elicits this much dialogue, and I think there's so much more to say about this show. I certainly have more questions to ask. So, but in the spirit of time, and I know you all are fasting, and I want you all to be able to eat and kind of get yourself together for tomorrow or whatever else. But this has really been eye-opening for me. And I'm going to watch the show again, because now I feel like, I get some of the jokes now because you all have, explained them to me, right? Which I'm sure, you've had to do, but in this setting, it's okay. It's not like I came to you. So tell me what this means instead of looking it up myself. But yeah, but this has been great. Thank you all so much. Shireen, I'm going to hand it over to you.
I won't keep people. I know it's near iftar. Thank you so much, Habiba and Banafsheh, for being here with us. And it was super fun, super informative. And I want to thank our community. I feel like we created a community here. It made me feel good to talk with you all and to hear from you all about Ramadan and Ramazan. So we'll see you again.
Say it, Shireen.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you all for having
Thank
us.
you. It was a lot of fun.
It was. Right. Take care, everybody.
Take
Bye-bye.
care.